Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Churchill Club CEO Karen Tucker.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Karen Tucker, and I'm a board member and the CEO of the Churchill Club. Our program this evening is called the Cybersecurity Challenge. We are very honored to have with us Dave DeWalt, CEO and President of McAfee, Gail Coury, Vice President of Risk Management, Oracle Global IT, John Mitchell, Professor of Computer Science, Stanford, and of course, our moderator, Richard Stiennon of IT Harvest. Thank you all very much for being here. And I would also like to thank McAfee for their very generous support of tonight's program. We certainly could not have done this without them. And a special nod to Joris Evers and Michelle Patterson. Thank you very much, McAfee. Briefly about our two upcoming programs. On Thursday morning, June 9, we present a breakfast program with California State Controller John Chang. And he will be in conversation with legendary venture capitalist Michael Moritz of Sequoia Capital. And given the epic budget crisis that we're experiencing now, this should be a very fascinating conversation. On Thursday, July 23rd, it's the free economy, how companies make money from giving things away. And there we have Gina Bianchini, CEO of Ning. We have Ranjith Kumaran, co-founder of You Send It, and the famous Chris Anderson, the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, who has a new book coming out on the topic right around that time, which we will sell. It will not be free. As always, you can get the latest information about the Churchill Club at churchillclub.org. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Twitter. You can view our videos on YouTube and at fora.tv. So now I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator, Richard Stiennon. He is an industry analyst that writes for several publications. He blogs profusely at threatchaos.com, and he is the most followed security twit on Twitter. I understand we have a few security twits in the room tonight. Richard has been an ethical hacker for PricewaterhouseCoopers, analyst for Gartner, CMO for Fortinet Inc., and he recently relaunched IT Harvest, an independent research firm that covers the 1,200 security vendors. And he's doing research for a book now, too. You can read more about him in the programs on your table. But what you won't read in your programs on the table is that Richard feeds his inner farmer by tending a hops yard that he and his son have built and are growing next to his garage. And he hopes to harvest a bumper crop this year and trade it to a local brew pub in exchange for a quantity of India Pale Ale. So you can ask him about that after the program. Let's welcome Richard Stiennon.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen, and thank you to the Churchill Club for putting together this great event, and thank you to McAfee for sponsoring it. I want to jump right into what obviously I've been following for a number of years, the Cybersecurity Challenge. And I want to ask each of our panelists to quickly tell us what your bias is. Where are you coming from? Why is the Security Challenge an issue for you? We'll start with Gail.
Okay, so I am amongst the panelists probably the practitioner, and so my job at Oracle is to oversee security of our global infrastructure. So we operate in 145 countries around the world, very large global network, couple 100,000 nodes. And so we see quite a bit of activity, of course, and not all of it is good activity. So from my perspective, I have a responsibility to protect Oracle's intellectual property and our assets and our users, and to make sure that none of our assets are used in a malicious way as well. So that's the challenge for me. I think it's changed significantly over the last couple of years in the way that we're seeing attacks come into the environment. They're intended to be very stealth. They can oftentimes lay very dormant in your environment. It makes our job in the security profession very difficult and keeps us all employed, I think, probably for quite a while. So busy.
Great.
What's the stress level?
Depends on the day. Good today.
And for a non-stress person, Dave?
Sure. Yeah. So Dave DeWalt, CEO of McAfee. What's interesting, we're also a big practitioner as well of security. Being a $2 billion business worldwide, we do business in 90 countries plus as well. All we do is dedicate ourselves to security. So we're the largest dedicated security company in the world. We've been setting up research and development all over the world, and what's been interesting is to watch the global landscape change so much over the last year or two, particularly as the internet's grown and the architecture for the internet has changed so much. So much of the way cybercrime and cybersecurity is being managed today has changed a lot, and it's changed for McAfee too. We're a heavily targeted company ourselves. Everybody wants to crack into the biggest security company, and we oftentimes face millions of attacks a month as a company, and we do everything in our power to make sure we're protecting not only our assets and our risk and our compliance, much the way Gail does, but we also lead by best industry practices as a company too, because that's certainly what we do as a vendor. So a lot of growth by McAfee and a lot of efforts underway to serve both the consumer market and corporate markets as well as governments around the world, and a lot of business both on the network security as well as the endpoint security for us, as well as risk and compliance. So broad portfolio with both a protect our own company as well as help protect other customers' charter as a company.
And John, your perspective.
Well, so I have the pleasure of teaching at Stanford, just a few miles north of here. And I love the computer security field. It provides job security for all of my students. We have a computer security lab. My colleague Dan Bonnet, who's a cryptographer, and I have been teaching there in the security area for 10 or more years. I've been interested in network security. In the last 5 or 6 years, we've been focused on web security. This has provided a lot of good problems for us, and it's a very accessible area. We've had a lot of good student projects. We got interested through identity theft and identity management and ways to improve on password security, and from there we've been involved in improving browsers, the architecture of the browser for supporting web-based applications, and different ways to, in addition to isolation between applications, allow communication between applications. So we see web security as a challenging and interesting area, network security, other areas in computer security. I'm glad to be here tonight. Outside of the university, I've been involved with companies that are seek to stop the spread of malware, and also web security companies.
Great, John. So you can see we've got a pretty broad spectrum of people engaged in fighting the battle. Probably the only chair that would be remaining empty there is somebody from the government, right? But you raised an interesting point, John. I just saw like 2 weeks ago the president of Estonia addressing a group of ministers from the EU, and he made the point that the bad guys outnumber the good guys, and that we should do more in our educational institutions to get people to become good guys that are fighting the bad guys. Have you seen, heightened interest and more students flooding into your department and away from the financial services groups?
That's a recent trend, I think you're asking about. Security takes a different mindset, and we've had a successful course for 7 or 8 years. And what we start with is a very challenging project where students try to find buffer overflows in code samples that we give them. And the main point of the starting project is just to educate them a little bit as to how hard attackers work. So I think one of the most common mistakes people make in software development is to say, oh, no one will ever exploit this problem. Nobody will ever do this. And once you see how hard it is to develop some of these exploits, you get the idea that the attackers are out there, are numerous, and whether individually they all work hard, somehow collectively they are equivalent to very, very, very clever people. And this provides an interesting challenge to try to beat them.
Dave, you've got a few people working at McAfee that are trying to discover what the bad guys are up
I
to.
want to employ some of the students that you've got. That
Yeah.
sounds good. Yeah, there you go. Well, it's interesting what John's saying, because there's certainly been a huge evolution in the way in which exploits have occurred. And you're alluding to it a little bit. I mean, we saw a real phase for many years where you kind of had that hacker in the basement, that teenager that was, you know, very curious about maybe hacking into a system. It was a hobby, and it was, you know, just an attempt to really make a name for themselves a little bit or see if they could do it. You know, the last few years has evolved a lot. We've really seen this thing go commercial. We've really watched cybercrime really become a business. And what's interesting, at least from my seat, for the last few years, watching how this has evolved, it's become a very big business. I mean, this is measured in billions and billions of dollars. The internet knows no boundaries. The exploits are amazing. How many of you heard of Patch Tuesday, right? Microsoft's Patch Tuesday. How many of you know how many zero-day attacks occur whenever there's a release by Microsoft? Well, you have many and many. And you end up with the hackers and the communities having the ability to understand exploits even when a large company like Microsoft or even Apple recently announced a patch. And so you oftentimes are watching this become so commercialized where these exploits are very quickly able to be understood and managed and exploited, that it's become just a very big business around the world, and the criminals are profiting. We have very few borders now that are out there from the internet point of view. And of course, you know, at this stage of the game, the sophistication is amazing to watch how far it's evolved.
I was told it was okay to jump in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jump in.
What I love is the advertising network. Advertising is great. If you want to put malware on somebody else's machine, just put it in an advertisement. Pay somebody a few bucks, it'll show up in hundreds of thousands of places.
Well, and
Good advice.
I was going to add that, you know, so the bad guys are outnumbering the good guys, but, you know, they only need one little tiny crack into your environment, right? So, you know, you think about a company the size that we are, and the numbers of systems and users and so on that we have, and the number of countries where, you know, we operate and where we have people connecting to the network. You know, it just needs to be one little place. And, you know, our job in security is that we have to cover all the bases to avoid that. So I think that puts it in a little bit different perspective as well. So,
Are you challenged in finding people to fill those roles?
good security people, very tough to find. You have to have a different mindset. I agree with what I think Dave said, is that, you know, you need to look at things not from how does it work, but how can you break it? And that's a very different perspective. Not a lot of people are skilled that way, so.
I've often wondered how the NSA or, you know, whoever is going to have the cyber command in the U.S. government is going to populate that with people, because most of the people I know who are good security people are unemployable, and especially would not pass a security clearance. So.
There's a lesson in that for somebody, I think.
All I've got is screen names. So a lot of people are frustrated because it seems like after all these years, somebody would have fixed this problem. And quite often it's, you know, the industry kind of, it's not quite an inside joke, but the industry is very thankful to Microsoft for creating a monoculture of devices that are very vulnerable and continuously vulnerable. So isn't somebody going to come along and layer on something on top of that to fix it? And as a corollary to that question, and speaking of giving things away for free, Microsoft announced they're renaming Moro to Security Essentials. And they released that this morning to 75,000 people are willing to be beta victims. What's the approach? How is everybody here impacted by Microsoft's actions or lack of?
I can start, because it's probably obvious for McAfee. I mean, we enjoy a big partnership. Being a large security company, we enjoy a good partnership with Microsoft. It's hard to say anything bad about our relationship there. We try to partner. We've got open APIs with them. We do testing with them. We often try to solve some of the patch releases, the zero-day attacks that they have. So it's a little bit of a co-opetition now with the new release that they've had. Although many of you probably know Microsoft's had a security product in the consumer space and even in the enterprise space for many years. They haven't had a whole lot of uptake of that product, just a couple % of market share. They oftentimes gave away the product for free before anyway. And it's a little bit of an oxymoron to say, okay, Microsoft has the vulnerabilities and they'll protect you, so it's a little bit of a contradiction. But having said that, we respect what they've done. They also have other features in that. And today, in the marketplace for consumer and for corporate, it's evolved so much more than just antivirus. And that's what's interesting about the changing threat landscape that Gail and John's alluding to. Viruses and the way in which viruses can be transmitted is only one of many dimensions for which security is a problem. Phishing attacks are big, data loss is an issue, identity theft is an issue, other types of rootkits and spyware and advertisements that can drive spamming and other types of problems related to malware. It's just such a diverse thing, and Microsoft has one little piece of that. So at least for McAfee, it's encouraging seeing Microsoft educate the world to the need of security, if you're in my shoes, but at the same time, it's not a lot of a threat to a company like us.
John, practically every student I see is using a Mac. Is that the solution?
They have a cooler cover on them now these days. So I don't really think that Microsoft does such a bad job in this sense. I think they're very popular, and so if you're going to attack people, David referred to the underground economy and the economic motives of people breaking into systems these days. If you want to make the most money, you're going to attack the systems that are most widely used. So that's one issue. I think if you look at other systems, if you applied a similar amount of effort to them, you'd find vulnerabilities in them too. Now about your issue about your suggestion that we could layer something on top to provide security, that's a very difficult proposition. And in many cases, although it's hard to speak generally about this, it's much better to design security in from the start than to try to layer a security solution on top. That has a much greater chance of being successful, I think.
Yeah, I would add, though, from my perspective, is that the complexity of the code today, the changing technology underneath, this all contributes to the problem because it's very hard to develop secure code, and not defending anything there, but I think we're going to see it get harder because of all these complexities and the rapidly changing way that we use technology. So, you've got to be able, you need to start there, I agree. You need to design security into your products and into your services that you're delivering from a technology perspective. But I also think you need to layer, defenses on top. You've got to make sure that, if you have a failure at one point, that you have another layer of defense that might be able to pick that up, to be able to detect that and so on. So I think that's part of why we look to companies like McAfee to help us in that area, because we can't always be dependent.
Can you speak in my tape recorder?
On the code.
So you've got Microsoft products inside Oracle?
Well, we develop on Microsoft's tech stack because our customers obviously use that in their applications. So of course we have some.
So there's a little bit of a buzz, resurgence of a buzz around whitelisting. So the problem statement is it's so hard to catch every single new piece of malware. There's 15,000 of them, every couple of weeks. Let's just only allow good programs. Is that something that's going to work? What do you think, John?
It has whitelisting versus blacklisting, and in many cases seems like a better approach. If you look at things like SQL injection or cross-site scripting on the web, things like that, it seems to be much more effective to whitelist the things the application is supposed to do rather than try to blacklist all the possible attacks because they're so hard to find. As far as having a short whitelist of all the things that could run on a platform, that's a little bit difficult. There are different architectures that are intended to try to keep some kind of track of what should be there, but it's a difficult direction. It may in the end be successful, I don't know.
Does everybody know? Sorry, Gail, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think also, when you think about this, there's a lot of capability or responsibility you have in configuring your applications. How do you integrate your applications together? You can make mistakes in any of those areas, and again, to me, that's all part of the challenge. So you can test the code, and the code can look good, but somebody turns a configuration, changes the configuration, maybe even at the operating system and not within the application or some other layer of the tech stack, and that can put your whole environment at risk. So, those I think are continuing to be challenges we have.
one of the most innovative and major technology changes we saw at McAfee happened just about a year ago. And I think as I look back a year ago on this release that we came out with, and now other security companies have done it too, it was probably the biggest change we ever saw, and it's relevant to black and white listing. We ended up putting an intelligent database in the cloud. And you all hear about cloud-based computing. Our model was called Artemis, but the idea behind it was a real-time communication from a PC or a mobile phone to a cloud. And what that enabled us to do is have real-time lookups against our cloud service to say, hey, is this piece of content, this file that maybe John just emailed me, is that a piece of content that is virus-free? Well, maybe I should look it up in the cloud to see if I've ever seen it before. And if I can do that real-time and all the time, I can begin to take the blacklisting world to a whole nother level as well. And we started to see detection rates because of this release go 99.99, and it was a very heavy capability that we've released that allows us to essentially detect almost any type of malware that comes from anywhere in the world, and that helped a lot. What we learned from that was, why couldn't we do that in the cloud for whitelisting too, and begin to offer applications in the cloud that are true and tested and secure as well. And we recently acquired a company that was a leader in that, a company called SolidCore. So for us, we think there's a number of devices that blacklisting might be the best solution for, that are highly dynamic. There's other types of devices that aren't as dynamic in terms of the amount of content you get on the device, that are more suitable for whitelisting. You know, think about embedded devices, IP addressable elements like your car, your refrigerator, who knows what. Everything's becoming IP addressable now. Some are better suited for application whitelisting, some for blacklisting, and it's going to be a mix over time. The good news is there's security models emerging for every type of device and every type of user, and you're able to at least protect whatever valuable information is on there.
So here's a question. What is the cloud, and what are the security challenges with it? And Gail, since you operate a cloud.
Did you say head in the cloud?
Well, you know, I mean, I think that what you're looking at is, you know, on-demand computing. And so as we look at it from our perspective, and as I look at it from how we run our operations and, you know, customer environments and so on, it's how do you ensure that you have proper separation and segregation of your information in your environments, you know, and then you have to be able to figure out within that on-demand computing space, how do you put all the same layers of control that you would have in traditional computing. And I think, you know, it's not easy there either. I mean, again, I think we're challenged in that space as an industry, and we're, you know, hoping for technology to catch up with, you know, some of the challenges there.
Seems to be a multiplier, because before you might have had a distributed solution, you know, one instance at every customer. Now there's one instance in your cloud, and now you just turned your product into critical information infrastructure.
From a research standpoint, cloud computing raises a lot of very interesting issues having to do with whether you trust the cloud provider or not. So I think there are very interesting questions having to do with whether, if you store all your email on a cloud provider, you could have that encrypted and search your encrypted email, for example. Or if you're storing data in some place and you want access control imposed on your data, how are you sure, how can you be confident that the provider is accurately imposing the access controls?
What's an example of a cloud? You know,
I mean, Google Docs, Gmail, Amazon S3, those kind of services.
Right. Cool.
I know the Silicon Valley here with this audience knows a lot about cloud computing. Many of you come from high-tech companies, but it's interesting to watch cloud computing reach every layer of the IT stack now. I mean, we're watching, you know, almost every layer. You allude to email and web applications and applications in general, databases, you know, identity management. I mean, name a layer in the IT stack now. You now have cloud computing or an application served through the internet that can serve that application base, and there's no end in sight to this. And it's really interesting to watch because, again, the same security challenges that we saw in our traditional client server type of models are now existing into the cloud models as well. And you know, it comes from different vectors of threats, but they're still there. It's not like it changed, and it's not like the commercial cybercrime groups are saying, hey, let's not go after the cloud, right? You know, it's still another attack zone that they're focused on.
Cloud providers could be very useful for attackers too.
That's right.
So here's a question, and it kind of launches off of the cloud idea, but last Valentine's Day, John Markoff over at New York Times published an article, and he had done some research, and he interviewed some folks from Stanford, and the question he posed was, do we need a new internet? Are the threats so great, the amount of spam, the denial of service attacks, is the internet finally going to collapse under its own weight, and do we need to architect something new? And if so, what is it, and can we do it? What do you think, John?
I'm going to take a stab at that. Do we need a new internet? Of course. We always need new things. Now, how is the new internet going to be different from the old internet? I'm not sure we really know the answer to that question. So I see it as a problem. If you were to start again from scratch, what would you do differently? So one of the most basic things is the current network will deliver a packet just because you sent it. So then you have a problem at the receiving end of trying to filter out things you didn't want. Would it be better to have the opposite basic design where in order to send a packet to a destination, you need permission first? Well, I don't really know. It might sound better to begin with, but then you have to follow through the consequences of that alternate design decision all the way through all of the kinds of applications we have. So I don't really know the answer. We do have a project at Stanford called the Clean Slate Internet Redesign Project, where we're trying to look at some of these issues. But personally, I don't know that the answers are really all in. It's a good thing to try, I think.
The challenges that you see now, I mean, at least from my perspective, is we do need a new architecture for the internet in so many ways. And we see this more from a security point of view because the governance model for the internet is what? There is none. I mean, if you look across the global architecture for the internet, you're like, well, who governs the internet? Is it ICANN? Is it, domain registration services? Well, they don't really govern it. They just govern the domain name itself or the issuance of the domain name. We lack a body, an organization that can manage the architecture of the internet. And that just does not exist today. And I'm not pro-regulatory compliance by any means, but because the internet's been so open, so architecturally adaptable, which has been great for usage and adoption, the bad thing is, what about terrorist attacks on the internet? What about warfare on the internet? What about crime on the internet? And how do we create law enforcement across the internet or policy across the internet? We haven't evolved very effectively in those areas, and you can really see it when, at least in our shoes from time to time, we know a crime has been perpetrated. The crime might have been perpetrated on a citizen, maybe in this room, but the criminal himself was somewhere halfway around the world. So who do we call? The Santa Clara Police Department? The local FBI? How do they help you apprehend a criminal somewhere around the world? And we don't have an architecture to do that anymore. And yet the boundaries for the internet is as easy as one IP address to another IP address. So we haven't evolved. We don't have the organization yet to really go there. And the pace and speed in which the internet is growing is remarkable that, if we don't figure that out, we can become victims of the internet as well. And that's what keeps me up at night from time to time, watching what's happening from a terrorist point of view, from a potential warfare point of view, from a crime point of view. And we've got to figure it out as a world body.
Yeah, so the idea is that, you send a packet, you receive a packet. How can you digitally sign or identify that packet as coming from, a good guy, a good source? And I don't know the answer to that either, but boy, it is a big challenge.
Well, to pick with something along that line, if you don't mind. So we had a discussion with Melissa Hathaway in the political process in Washington. And one of the things on her list is this network goal called attribution, which would involve, for any packet you receive, being able to tell where it came from. And I think for many network people, this is the be-all and end-all of network security. If what you're concerned with is some of the network routing layers, then I think you can actually protect against some of the most common threats if you can determine where packets are coming from. Under a distributive denial of service attack, you can find where they're coming from. You can try to shut down the flow of packets from a distance. But at application layers, it seems to me this is not really going to solve a lot of our problems. If you trace where spam is coming from, you'll find some poor person's home computer that's been infected by a bot, and you'll find somebody who knows nothing about the attack or how it got there. And I don't think it will really lead you back easily to the perpetrator of the attack. So there's some issue there. I think there's going to be political discussion about the importance of this problem, and I'm hoping we take a balanced view about that, but we'll see.
I can't tell you how many times we get an escalation at McAfee sometimes where, you know, the victim is the corporation who's actually the one issuing all the spam. And they don't realize it, but they've actually harbored a botnet on their own network who's actually the one spamming all the consumers. And how easy it was sometimes to have deployed a botnet into an architecture as John describes. And it's interesting to watch the evolution again as to, you know, how this malware is distributed, how you might get it, and then how it's used. It's fascinating usage right now.
John, you brought up Melissa Hathaway, and I want to kick off the discussion about the U.S. government and what they should do in security by posing this question. So you get a call from President Obama's chief of staff asking you to come to Washington and, you know, meet with whoever, possibly the president. What do you ask them? What do you tell them?
I like my job, so I'm perfectly happy here in sunny California, but what do you say? So, I mean, there has been a review. There have been a list of priorities and problems, and they're all interesting challenges. One of the things I'd like to see is deployment of existing technology or existing ideas. There are lots of things that are known in research that haven't been deployed. I'll give you my favorite example to keep it brief. We have a lot of problems related to password-based authentication on the web. There exist other protocols that are known to cryptographers that, if widely deployed, would shut down a very significant amount, if not all, phishing attacks. Why are they not deployed? There are some issues having to do with patents and who has control of the intellectual property. And there's just the big problem of getting everyone to switch from one thing to another across the entire web. But I think there are incremental deployment possibilities. The web vendors many are based on open source platforms. We can extend the open source platforms with these password authenticated key exchange protocols. And I think by putting existing research into practice, we can solve not all of our problems, but some of the most important ones.
Dave, I think you had a situation similar to the one I just posed.
Yeah, I did. I had a chance to meet President Obama a couple weeks ago. I don't know how many of you had a chance to hear about the cybersecurity announcement press conference that President Obama did. This was pretty unprecedented to see the President of the United States talk about cybersecurity and the challenges related to cybersecurity. And I had a chance to meet him and have a chance to talk about it. And I said the same thing as John said. I was perfectly happy in my job here in sunny California. But
you look the part better more than I do. So.
But you know what's amazing is watching the president's technical grasp of the situation. And I kind of had my 1 minute of fame where I had a chance to, you know, talk to the president, and I just said, you know, it was amazing use. I said, Mr. President, you know, Dave DeWalt, McAfee, I said, what a great use of technical terms, because he used the word bots and botnets and malware and Trojans and worms. And if you heard it, he was using all these technical terms that, you know, came out. And he said he had a good briefing by Melissa, so he did compliment Melissa, but also that this was a problem. And if you heard the press conference, one of the things that happened to the president, he acknowledged, which was his campaign database was hacked into during the election process, and he admitted it. And what was really nice about the president, he was very humble. He's a very humble man, I found out. And he had talked about, he said, yeah, it got hacked into, but don't worry, I didn't lose anything, he says, and not of importance anyway. And we were all like, huh? He just admitted that he got hacked into, you know, live on television. But his literacy on the technical issues was impressive. I think his attention and prioritization to the challenges was impressive. And, you know, we're hoping through both Melissa Hathaway as the temporary cybersecurity czar and hopefully a permanent one, that we'll continue to raise the stakes a little bit as a country and as a government to address these issues.
Gail, do you think there's the operational underpinnings in the government to do
Well,
anything about it?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, well, didn't we just change everybody over to digital TV though? So I don't know if that's like any sort of sense of how we can change the consumer environment and the use of technology by consumers and the enterprises. I think we do most enterprises, large enterprises, do a pretty good job on security and making sure that we're not running bot networks out of our networks, for example. But that it's the consumer, the everyday person that is sitting in their home and on the internet all the time. So how do you change that mindset? How do you educate them? And this is stuff that's not easy for them to understand. And so that's part of, I think, a big part of our issue.
So Melissa Hathaway has suggested in the CPR, which is the Cybersecurity Policy Review, that there be assigned a cybersecurity policy officer or coordinator, but that person is not to be given the authority to actually set cybersecurity policy. They must coordinate everything. Is there enough teeth in that recommendation or that role or that position to get the job done?
I think it remains to be seen. This is a very important crossroads I think we're at. Who's the individual who's actually named? How much authority do they have? How are they reporting? It looks like it's going to report both to an economic council and a security council. It looks like it's going to have some broad policy decisioning kind of capability, but it remains to be seen. The interesting part of this is it's all new ground for the government to go through. They're still trying to figure out, which agency is working this. Is this Homeland Security? Is this National Security? Should we have this a part of the White House? Should it report to the White House? How do we architect our own organization to address this? And I think they're taking their time to look at it, make sure they measure twice, cut once as they do. Hopefully we make some progress. We'll see some announcements soon. And I'm hoping that we can really see some policy come in this direction. I think it's important for all of us.
Pick up briefly on getting the job done. So there are many ways you could think about what a realistic expectation and desire is. If you think about computer security compared to, say, healthcare, is the Surgeon General getting the job done? Well, no, people are still sick. We still have doctors. People go to the hospital. But maybe there's still some improvements as a result of government activity in that area. And so I don't see really the computer security problem, as diverse and widespread as that is, going away in the next 5, 10, 15 years. There will always be misuse of systems that we build. But we can make improvements. We can raise awareness. We can have rewards of some kind for well-designed, well-maintained systems. And I think those kind of steps are completely feasible.
I just add on to what John said. I think the Surgeon General sort of analogy is a great one. And if you looked at what Melissa had talked about and President Obama looked at, they said one of the most important pillars to all this is education. And if there's just one thing we accomplish is we're educating people to the challenges that are out there. And a little bit of Surgeon General, if you smoke, you can get sick, you can die. There's some things like that and analogies to security as well. And I think you're going to see, she used the Smokey the Bear or the click it or ticket kind of analogy of trying to get some sort of mindset for people to use a security product, whether it's free from Microsoft or from McAfee or whomever, but be educated on this. We only have about 50% of the computers that are in use today even have a security product. Even the ones that are using a security product may only have an expired version of it or somehow. So if we can educate, maybe there's a way to help improve on the situation.
I just wish you had 2 examples of programs that worked.
True.
So it's not just a U.S. problem, obviously, because the internet is not the U.S. in any sense of the term. And I see Whitehall announcing that they're going to appoint a cybersecurity czar, and Finland has just announced their new cert, similar to Estonia's. So are we entering it almost sounds like we're entering a phase of arming with each nationality assigning their own leader, and czar is probably an appropriate term. Are we going to get these fiefdoms set up where they're shooting at each other over the internet, or are they going to start working together to solve the main problems? You've had a little exposure to that, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest thing I worry about as I've traveled the world and I've met with a lot of the governments is we're seeing some internet protectionism occur. And internet protectionism is they want to protect their own IP backbone. They might want to do so in a way that could be harmful to global trade and commerce. We see that in economic times. I'm sure a lot of you have watched the current economic situation. You know, if you get too much nationalism, protectionism into the model, you could repeat was it the Smoot-Hawley Act that happened in, you know, back in the Great Depression, which exacerbated the economic situation. We can get that, and in the internet, in the world of security, we're seeing a little of that. Each country doing its own thing. They're all trying to arm themselves to protect themselves from terrorism, but potentially use it offensively for warfare as well. And you know, we've seen now at least 20 countries worldwide really getting armed offensively for warfare. Not to say they've used it, but you used your Estonia example. We've seen some examples around the world where one country has attacked another country entirely through cyber means. And through that one example of buffer overflows or ways to create denial of service attacks against the infrastructure. And we watched Russia attack Estonia, Georgia, some other examples where you start to see this as a means for which governments or nationalities or terrorist groups can invoke harm on another body or entity. And we're just at a very nascent state of this. I mean, we're just starting to get into this, and a lot of it will depend on how governments and nationalities set up their organizations, work together, and hopefully we can evolve past nationalism as a way of doing it.
I was surprised when I visited Estonia and talked to their cyber defense group and asked them, you know, aren't there people from the US in here like every single week finding out what you're doing? And their answer was no, it doesn't happen very often. There's so much to be learned from what they've been through and what they've done to resolve it, because they're actually following a private-public partnership, just as Melissa Hathaway is calling for. So there's a lot to do.
And that's an encouraging thing. If you haven't followed, at least what President Obama talked about was to create a public, i.e. government, interlock with private sector. And it's companies like Oracle and McAfee and Stanford Research Labs or other areas where they essentially can interlock with private. And this is the first time we've really seen a major effort where the government may interlock from an education point of view, from a technology point of view, from a process point of view to help solve this, because I think they realize the government can't solve it on its own. That little things like critical infrastructure are important, or education's important, or other things that are IP addressable that are internet infrastructure are important. They can't do it all themselves, so they have to partner. And I think other countries in the world will do the same thing, and that's a step in the right direction, but we're just took our first baby step, and we've got a long way to go.
So Gail, is a large company like Oracle set up to partner with the federal government? Do you send representatives to InfraGard meetings with the FBI? And
Yeah, well, you know, federal government is a significant customer of ours in a lot of ways, and yes, we work with them and meet with them and you know, run some systems for them, both from a hosting perspective and a, you know, a consulting perspective. So I think the challenge though that I see in this is that we're a global player, right? And so as you're talking about all of the different countries in the world and their approach and what they're taking, actions they're taking to secure their piece of the internet, we're a company that's interwoven between that. So we're a US-based company, certainly, but we operate around the world. So it'll be interesting to see what impact we have on that. I mean, already today, the regulatory environment and all of the issues surrounding that keep us very busy. And making sure in this part of the country and in this part of the world and so on that, you know, we haven't crossed, you know, any kind of lines, or we're not being limited by the network services and so on that are being offered in those countries, or what can we do to counteract that. So.
Gail, I mean, and we have the same issue being a global company. The number of regulatory compliances we see from every country are all different. I mean, we are facing, it's amazing to do business globally right now when every country, every vertical you sell to sometimes, or every industry has a different one. It's a challenge to go to market worldwide as we're watching compliance, security, and other aspects be very territorial with their own regulatory compliance. It's a big challenge for folks like Gail, that's for sure.
Okay, I want you to put on your tinfoil hats and get as paranoid as you can and tell us, what your worst cybersecurity nightmare would be. And we're not going to hold you to it. Nobody's going to make fun of you. But how bad could it get? John.
I'm usually not a paranoid security guy. I mean, I think many people get go overboard on this. But how bad could it get? As bad as you like. I mean, the network could stop working. We could not be able to communicate with each other, and all of our information that's online could be compromised and stolen. So I think that's everything that's electronic is in some way vulnerable, and we have to keep working at ways to keep ahead of people who mount attacks and try to shut things down.
If you ask that to your students, would they say, just don't take my Facebook account? Is that no, not my Facebook account.
Very, very dependent on all of these things now for many, many functions.
Well, I actually, I participated in some scenarios, warfare scenarios. And, it's interesting, I think, that if we had a collapse in in any area of the internet, that would undermine people's reaction in other aspects of their life. So if you're talking about a significant incident that occurs within the financial systems, for example, then you have I'm going to, run on the bank, or I'm going to pull all my assets to my, put them in my mattress, or whatever the case might be. But I think that what we would see is more fallout from that kind of situation than simply the incident that occurred from a technology perspective. And all of our information is electronic, so everything about you, what you buy, what you sell, your health records, all of this today is electronic. So I think, we have to realize how delicate and important and critical this situation is, just because of the way that we've changed and how we do business. You go to the doctor's office today and, they put everything in a laptop, or they add, your medical information to a server. They don't carry charts and files and things like that anymore. And so the way we operate has changed. So I think we have to take that into perspective.
Yeah, have you ever been in the office when the email server goes down and everybody just stops? They all go to the water cooler, and some people take off and go home. And yeah. I mean, what did we used to do before we had email?
Exactly.
The part that worries me is, it isn't so much the banks or some of where our money is at. They have tremendous security strategies, a lot of the more mature corporations. The one that worries me is watching our critical infrastructure. These are the power companies, the energy companies, and so many of them are going from analog to digital models, right? I don't know how many of you heard of SCADA, but these are the projects where they're trying to move to the digital age a bit and interlock their infrastructure, like traffic lights to water supply to energy to the internet. And it's these elements that could be attacked or brought down so easy. And it's our water supply, it's our electrical grid, it's our critical infrastructure. And when you look at the investments that they are making in the security or protecting it, it's very small compared to more mature corporations that are out there. So what keeps you up and what worries you is, what are they going to do to protect it? And this is what the government's called out a bit, is can we protect it? They called it NIP. It was the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. But how do they regulate critical infrastructure to upgrade its security? There's not a whole lot of mandate to do it, no money to do it necessarily. Yet they're all becoming online internet, and I'm sure a lot of you saw the mapping of the electrical grid that occurred, and who was behind that. It was all in the press and the papers about this. But how easy was it for them to map our electrical grid? And obviously, there was cyber espionage that occurred to figure this out. If you can figure it out, you could also do damage to it, and it makes you worry that that could occur. And how do we stop it?
Now I'm starting to feel the fear. So. If we had that last chair occupied, that's not there, by somebody from the Defense Department, what would be their worry? Speculate.
A lot of their field operations, a lot of their operations in general are all controlled electronically. So from central points of command, I imagine, in some of my discussions that I've had, with some of our military folks, that's, I think, where their concern is. So.
Network-centric warfare has been a phrase in Washington for several years. And you have, like other organizations, military runs on a more or less standard computer network with some enhancements. But any network failure for some distributed, complex operation is going to be catastrophic.
So one last question is, as we address the security issues, what happens to privacy? Does that get shoved aside?
Not necessarily. So, I mean, I'll stick my neck out slightly, but as an academic and scientist, I really don't see that there's a trade-off there. There isn't really a fundamental trade-off between security and privacy, or at least I haven't seen it. In many, many cases, if you have a security goal, there's a way to achieve that security goal and also achieve reasonable privacy goals at the same time. It may take a little more work. It may take a slightly more sophisticated form of cryptography. But not only is it a good idea from a philosophical, legal, and sociological standpoint, but also privacy means somebody who's your adversary doesn't know some information about you. So I think there are also good reasons from a defensive and security standpoint to seek forms of privacy that make systems no more transparent than they need to be in order to achieve their design goals.
I think security supports privacy. So, in order to be able to have information that is private, you need to put security controls around it. So, my philosophy on this is that, everything is about the data. It's about protecting the information. And so if you can use encryption to be able to protect the information, you not only provide security, assuming then that you have reasonable access controls into that data, but you also provide privacy. You can have models that support your privacy of that information. And when you have the vulnerability that comes into your environment, if the data itself is encrypted, and there's, I'm oversimplifying, of course, because you have a lot of things you have to put around that, but I think the more that we can get to, the encryption of the information, and then making sure that that information kind of carries a tag with it that says this is what this information is for, and these are the people, so it's attributes around that information as to who can access it and so on. We're not there technically to be able to do that, but that will help us get along a far way down the road, I think.
I'd just add on, I agree a lot with Gail and what John said. I mean, certainly security enhances privacy. There's no doubt about that. I mean, certainly what we see is how do we protect people's data, not expose their data. I mean, that's what we're all about. But having said that, when you look around the world, there's 90 different privacy laws right now. I mean, almost every country has a different privacy law, and it's very difficult to keep up with those laws. In some cases, they actually come from the private sector, not even the public sector. Some of you probably heard of PCI, the payment card industry. These were the credit card companies consortium to come together to essentially help do data notification and data breach notifications to consumers if consumer data was lost. But it came from the private world, from the corporations, not from the government. And so, many of the different industries have different ways they are governed by privacy. And we haven't come together with, again, a global architecture for how to manage privacy or how to regulate privacy. And I think we need to, again, evolve to get there.
Great. I want to open it up to the audience to continue a long-standing Churchill Club tradition and letting the audience ask the question. So we've got microphones that are going to travel along. Here's one. Here's a question.
Jean-Baptiste Su with the French news agency. This is a question for Dave. Two questions. What are the works that you're doing in China with the Chinese government to sort of create that digital wall that they're trying to build And the second question is, what do you think about security in social networks, like you were mentioning Facebook and so on?
Sure. Good questions. Certainly, at least for us, you know, we, much like Gail had said earlier, we're a global company, so we do business with security in every country. China, of course, is a high growth market. We're doing as much as we can to partner with corporations, with consumers, with government in China as well. Certainly for us, we've done distribution agreements with large partnerships there to distribute our technology. We've set up and even do some development there. So it's been an area of growth opportunity, much like it is for almost all the high tech area. I can't really comment about, you know, the Green Dam project, I think is what you're referring. I don't really have an involvement with that, so not much concept there. Certainly from social networking, this has been one of the most fertile areas of security problems that have been out there. A lot of you might have heard there's been a number of pretty large security challenges related to the Web 2.0 architectures. Maybe you've heard of one called Coopface. This was kind of Facebook kind of amalgamated. It was a virus that was spread pretty heavily through the Facebook architecture. We've seen other attacks on other social networks. The Twitter worm was pretty widely publicized as well, that had widespread types of deployments. Whenever you have a big social networking environment, you have an opportunity to have security challenges. We're seeing this as one of the biggest areas of attack and vectors of attack right now. But most of them are really upgrading their architectures. It's encouraging to see. And you're seeing more and more of that as we move forward. I think the initial designs of the Web 2.0 architectures weren't suited necessarily for understanding that problem, but I think they're quickly changing and hopefully a safer place.
Question back here.
Yeah, Susan Dawson with Engineera. Do you see any involvement or any way to involve global collaboration in the solution? So, you know, right now that at least especially in this panel, it looks like there's a panel of experts and a team behind each panel, and then there's the whole world of hackers. But next to that whole world of hackers, there's an even bigger world of people who, you know, have goodwill. So do you see a way to include, you know, global collaboration in the solution?
Let's take that.
Sure. Next question.
Well, how about at conferences,
Yeah, so
global conferences?
Yeah, the research community and scientific and research community and innovative entrepreneurial communities are worldwide. I think Dave referred to another kind of idea, which has to do with pooling information from different end hosts that may detect viruses or malware, and trying to share information. It doesn't make too much sense in the long run for everybody to run the same virus scanner without them communicating in some way or pooling information. I think there's a lot of potential in that direction.
First, the Federation of Incident Response Teams is meeting this week in Japan, and that's a global organization of really the geeks that really do fix the problems when they happen. And they get together all the time and talk. It's they're kind of the guardian angels of the internet, and they're out there working for us all the time.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love your concept, by the way. It's the right direction. We've had a lot of grassroots groups get together. These are the organizations that come together to understand vulnerabilities. I think you alluded to the InfraGards of the world, but these are user groups that kind of get together and share information. We have a number of technology groups. Yep. So, but can we get there? Can we come together as a community, a worldwide community, to help fight against the crime or the terrorism in a way? I think we have to get there. We need a World Health Organization-like construct, like WHO, but it's really for the cyber world, not necessarily for health viruses. But if we create an organizational body like that, that can come together, that can put bulletins out, that can solve problems quickly, you know, that's the right direction as a community.
Good analogy.
There's a question.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So, question, Tim Mather. Question is for John, really, since you were the first one to bring up the magic word of attribution tonight. All of the discussion this evening has been reactive. It's all been about defending. And I'm not necessarily saying that we should go on the offensive as far as information warfare is concerned, but the issue is that without attribution, there's no accountability. And we're at a point right now where there basically is no accountability. The capture rate, if you will, of suspects here is ridiculously low on how many folks actually get any sort of go to trial, let alone go to jail. So how do we get accountability if we can't get attribution? And if we do get accountability, how can we do that while maintaining privacy? We've got to do better at accountability. And so how do we do that, please?
Okay, good question. I think, yeah, great question. I think basically the statement I was trying to make before is that attribution in and of itself doesn't provide accountability because of all the compromised machines. Now, how do you find out who perpetrated some act? I think it's complex, and I think we need to look through all the possibilities to see whether, on balance, some of the proposed mechanisms for trying to track things are overall a win or not. Do they complicate systems in a way that makes them less useful? What are the basic trade-offs there? So I don't have the answer. The only statement I would stand by still is that I think simply implementing attribution on the network doesn't really solve the problem.
Well, I think you hit on, a great question there, Tim. It's interesting to watch the world right now. I mean, how many crimes are being perpetrated that, when did you read about the actual conviction later or even the arrest? I mean, we don't even see this. And we're watching this happen every day because we don't have a mechanism to attribute where it came from. And it's amazing to watch the sophistication. I know you know this, but we're seeing phishing attacks on major architectures now where they're changing domain names tens of thousands of times in minutes to hours. So how do you trace a DNS 10,000 times during the course of a couple-hour period for attribution even? It is a very complicated attack vector that's coming on. Some of you might have seen the check-free one that happened with the payment online systems. I mean, these were highly sophisticated attacks. And of course, there was a lot of allegation that might have been somewhere perpetrated in a far-off country, but how do you go and track down the criminals? If we don't have some attribution to the internet, you have no way of doing that necessarily. But at the same time, how do you keep privacy? It's a conundrum that's very difficult to overcome. I don't know that there's an easy answer for it, but it's at the heart of the challenge that's out there right now.
Hi, Patrick Olson from National University. Usually we like to ask a question about what should we be doing in higher education, but out of deference to Dr. Mitchell, who is doing a great deal already, that didn't seem to be a question that made a lot of sense. So we're going to shift it a little bit from what we ordinarily ask to note that education has been mentioned several times as the solution to all of this. And a couple of things weighed heavily in my mind as I thought about this. First of all, we do have information assurance type programs that are doing things, so that contribution is clearly there. Secondly, K through 12 typically hasn't really stepped up to this and computing generally, so we usually do it in college. Thirdly, we've sort of moved away from an intro to computing course that's required of everybody about 10 or 15 years ago, simply because the consumer electronics type products mean that to participate, people don't need to go through any hoops to be part of the system anymore. So being mindful of all of these things, and I'll just direct this to the panel generally, except for Dr. Mitchell, who probably doesn't need to answer it. What do you think we're supposed to do in higher education to help the process along of fixing the security problems? Thank you.
Great question. Gail, do you want to start?
No, I mean, I can offer my opinion on that, and I think that, every single student that comes through our systems needs to be educated about some aspect of computer security, and I would say that waiting to higher education is a little late. So the kids are online, they're young, they don't understand, they don't know, and there's a lot of controls we can put in place, but there's, my own son knows very, very well that you don't share your password. So some things that he's learned because this is something that's important to mom. But I think if we can get to kids as they're starting to use technology at young ages and at their level and throughout their educational period, all through their lives, we can get there. That's not the end all be all. But as I said earlier, we do a lot in enterprise and private sector. There's a lot being done in the government areas around security and acknowledging that we have these issues. But we have consumers every day that get online, and if they're not smart about how they protect their systems, then their systems fall victim and are used to attack other systems. And I think that's if we can start the ball rolling with young children and up, we'll get there.
No, I agree. As much as we can do at an earliest age as possible is great. Watching, I have 3 kids, how quickly they adapt to technology is just amazing. I lost out an Xbox a long time ago to every game against all 3 of my kids, but it's amazing to watch them adapt. How do we educate them to the security aspects of it? And I'm just really passionate about, what John does. How do we reinvigorate technology into our higher education system? As a global, technology provider, I think America's lost a lot of edge when it comes to this. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but watching, just the technology savviness coming out of our higher ed in the United States vis-a-vis other places in the world, I mean, we're not at the same level. We need to reinvigorate that. Security is one of many areas to reinvigorate. But I'm encouraged. Hopefully, we can drive at that better in the coming years with the new administration. It's so needed. It's an area of passion for me, for sure.
This is a question for all the panelists. From a customer point of view, the security landscape is very confusing. They hear about different terminologies, NAC, pre-connect NAC, post-connect NAC, admission controls, and they're quite confused. How much security do I need? Do I wait till my house is on fire before I check my smoke detector, or how many layers of defense do I need? So from a security vendor's perspective, do you see the need for the vendors to work collaboratively so that security is seen as a distributed problem? It cannot be solved at one place by one vendor, but it has to be done in a collaborative way as multiple layers of defense, where information goes from one to the other.
To add some color to the question, I track 1,200 security vendors worldwide. And I had a similar question from somebody who turned out afterwards to be the CIO of the US Army, but he came up to me at a booth at a trade show and he said, "Why are you security vendors constantly trying to sell us a new box? How come you're always coming back to us?" And of course the answer is because the threats are changing constantly. And the one thing when you're analyzing the security industry that sets you apart from somebody who analyzes, business intelligence software or customer relationship management software is that it's a different industry every 6 months. It's changing so rapidly, and it's not just standing still long enough for anybody to grasp just what solutions they have to apply. But
I can take, I'm a consumer of security technology, obviously, and just managing our environment. And, from my perspective, the way that we approach it is look at what's good security practice. So you've got, how do you protect your information when it's in transit? How do you protect it when it's at rest? How do you authenticate and make sure the user that's logging on to the system is the right user and so on? So if you look at it from that perspective, and then you look at the controls you have in place, then you can identify where your gaps are. A lot of the security products in the market today do overlap, and so what you may be buying, this product to do something, but it also does X, and so, and then maybe you already have a product that does X too. So how do you make those decisions? And the only way you can do it is look at the controls around the information, the criticality of the information. Are you worried about the integrity of the data, that it's not tampered with? Are you worried about its confidentiality? Somebody can. So you have to understand the attributes of what you're trying to protect, and then what you have in place, and identify your gaps, and that's what you can do.
I really resonate with the question too, if I could add on, Gail, is a couple of years ago I transitioned into the security market, and you know, I went up to the RSA conference, as I know you've covered many times too, and you see the 1,200 vendors that are there. What was remarkable to me when I first got into this was why none of the 1,200 were actually working together. Now it's a little exaggeration, I'm sure some of them are, but not many. I mean, you don't see a lot of interoperability across security products, and I thought that was an opportunity, at least from my standpoint here at McAfee. We tried to open up our architecture, integrate with as many partners as we possibly could, try to do threat correlation across vendors as much as we could, and I think we need to keep doing more of that. It's important to be able to have best-of-breed technologies in every area of defense somehow integrated better so that we can always be stopping whatever latest threat that's out there. And it's an important evolution. You don't often see segments of IT that don't have standards, not a lot of interoperability. Security is a space that hadn't had a lot of standards or interoperability, not like a database or an application layer where you have very mature standards that are out there, ANSI SQL standards or other types of standards. Security doesn't have a lot of that. We need to keep moving in that direction and keep opening that up, keep partnering, because that's how we'll solve some of the complex threats.
And the only other thing I would add to this is, you know, and I'm pretty passionate about this too, is that not all your security problems are solved by technology. You know, oftentimes, and we in the security business are probably, you know, guilty of it more than others, is, I've got this problem. Well, I can go buy this particular software or this particular device to fix that problem. A lot of our, what we have to do is get disciplined and better about the way we configure and manage and operate our systems, and then we can talk about, you know, the technology gaps we need to fill beyond that. But I think oftentimes we don't do that basic piece first. We don't review new services or new systems for security design. We don't, you know, the access controls. We think about those things later. So it's really important that you build that in your entire life cycle and get disciplined about how you operate and maintain it.
I don't remember whether your question was from an enterprise or an individual standpoint. I think from an enterprise standpoint, you can pay somebody smart and they'll tell you an answer. And for an individual, very simple answer, go to any college or university and look up their advice to students on what to install on their computers before they plug them into the university network, and they'll give you some list of things you should install.
Question back here.
Good evening, Jeff Richards. I'm with the Office of the CIO, and as my wise old grandfather used to say, locks are only for honest people, meaning they keep honest people honest. And as you've pointed out, the bad guys are ever industrious and continually at work while we sleep. My clients are generally in the $1 billion and below range, and they don't have lavish IT budgets. So I want to take it out of the global view to the smaller company. If you've got a limited discretionary budget, where would it be best spent to get the most bang for the buck from a protection standpoint?
Kick that off because at Gartner we asked that question internally once, and we even couched it in terms of, okay, you've got $100 per user per year to spend. Where do you spend it to get the best bang for the buck? And the assumption is you've got antivirus deployed, you've got firewalls deployed, and the answer then was strong authentication, because one of your biggest threats is your trusted end users, and you've got to have accountability, attribution for end users as well. So it was authentication was the straight answer there.
Well, there's a lot of work been done for mid-size, small-size, under billion-dollar companies in the area of security. So much of it has gone to cloud computing. And we've got a lot of technology out there today in the security landscape that can almost make security completely seamless to an organization that has almost no IT or just very little IT today. You can do web filtering in the cloud, email filtering in the cloud, archiving, backup, recovery. You can do all kinds of malware in the cloud now, and it requires almost no IT for a small business. So there's a lot out there today that's evolved, some of which has just come on the landscape in the last couple of years. And now you can get even what's called unified threat management appliances, probably you know them pretty well, UTM appliances, all-in-one appliances that do pretty much everything for security for your network. These have evolved pretty greatly for smaller companies, and they're very easy to install and deploy at this point in time. So security has been able to create elasticity downward for small businesses, either through the cloud or through common appliances at this point that can do a lot of technology cheaply, effectively, and not much work to be done.
And from my perspective, I would say, you know, protect the connection that you have to your public network. And then what's behind that, that's for the small business. Be, like I said, just disciplined about keeping your patching current, making sure that, you know, you've done the right kinds of things about configuring your systems. You know, you can find out this information. There's lots of checklists that are available to people that to do that, and that's more work than it is a tool. And it's about making sure the end users at that small business are educated and understand what the risks are, so that, you know, they're taking care of their systems and their environments and how they're communicating with people outside the business that, you know, is important.
Question over here. Oh, there it is, way back there.
Hi, I'm Brad Redderson from Sternova. I had a question about the mobile telecom area, which is something I haven't heard anything about. And as we're talking about ubiquitous computing, this is an area where not only are the phones getting more powerful as computers, they are also probably some very interesting targets between push services and different synchronization technologies going back and forth, streaming media going in and out, and largely probably exploding much faster than a lot of the other parts of the computer industry. Is this something to be paranoid about? What are you guys doing about it? What do you see is coming in the future and in that area? Thanks.
Gail, you must have a few mobile phones in your area too.
Yeah, actually we do, and we have a lot. We have you know, smartphones. It's how our people work today. You know that, and they're certainly much more powerful than they've been in the past. And you know, it is challenging for us, to be quite honest. And again, you know, what can we do? We can protect the device. We can protect the transmission of the information to and from the device. And we can authenticate the users on the devices, and we can, you know, make sure that the device itself is authenticated. So there's a few things that you can do there, and today, you know, we're, I guess, not perfect in that space, but, you know, if you can do those 4 things, you know, you've got a lot of your risk covered.
There's a lot of investment being done by the telecommunications companies today in the area of security. So this is encouraging. There are a lot of programs called Clean Pipes initiatives. If you come from that industry segment, you know the whole goal here is to create essentially bandwidth, IP bandwidth to the corporation or even to the home that is essentially clean bandwidth. What does that mean? You know, free of spam, you know, basically URL filtered, free of denial of service type attack capabilities or malware. And the idea is to have a clean pipe to your business that essentially can put security into the back-end telecommunications architecture. Many of the large companies are working on those initiatives, as well as putting lightweight agents onto mobile devices, smarter phones, whether it be encryption of your SIM card so that in case you lost your phone, you could have all your data encrypted, or it's whitelisting on the phone to only accept certain applications. But now the technology is evolving pretty dramatically on the mobile landscape, on the phones and on the devices, as well as the back-end pipes architecture for the telecommunications companies. So a lot of speed in that direction right now.
Very challenging area. Some things are better, some things are more difficult challenges. In addition to the points that have been mentioned, there are issues about user interface. There are security indicators, for example, on a browser that you see on a laptop that give you some idea of whether the site has authenticated itself properly to you. There's not a lot of space on a small device to show additional security indicators. There will be more problems when we have more open platforms so that people can write applications freely for mobile devices. At the same time, it's a chance to do things again, learn from our experience with previous generations of computing, and I think that opens some possibilities up too.
And, you know, we've had, you know, there's passionate debates about doing remote wipe capabilities on these devices, and then, you know, the privacy laws in certain parts of the world, and can you really do a remote wipe of the data, and so on and so forth. So it's, there's, you know, as with any new kind of technology, we have new challenges, and that's, I think, what we're seeing here, and you know, we'll solve them, and then we'll have new technology that we'll be working on.
What gives me hope is there's multiple platforms, so we don't have a monoculture of a same platform everywhere, and you have proprietary networks. So you really do have carriers that can provide clean pipes and clean the stuff up before it gets to you. In Japan, I just learned they get, on average, an individual in Japan gets 10 spam SMS messages a day. Can you imagine getting that to your cell phone here? It's, you know, you'd throw it out the window if you were allowed to use cell phones in cars. It's unbelievable. Oh yeah, people talk to you. Question here.
Hi, my question, you talked a lot about security. My question is around the regulatory environment and compliance. Do you see a tight tie between being secure and being compliant? You know, are the regulations working? And are those the same systems or those different systems? We see if you look at the marketing charts, people are spending as much on compliance as they are on security. And, you know, what's your view on that? Are they the same? Are they different? Are they related?
I would say that they're related, but we don't address security controls where there isn't risk. And generally speaking, if you address risk in your environment properly, you'll be compliant. So the way that we look at it, and part of what I do at Oracle, many of you may not know, but we have a hosting business, a pretty sizable hosting business of a couple thousand customers, some in an ASP model, some in a software as a service model. But there are all different verticals, all different industries, and we see a lot of regulatory compliance for our financial services customers that's different than our healthcare customers, that's, you know, different than our customers who do a lot of credit card transaction processing, for example. But at the end of the day, when you look across all of those regulatory requirements, about 85–90% are all the same. It's good, sound security controls that you have in place. Then you have the nuance for each regulatory requirement. But if you properly protect that information, in other words, I'm not interested in having a disclosure of credit card information off the systems that are operating in our environment. So am I interested in making sure that data is encrypted? Yes. Am I interested in making sure that we have the proper controls within the application, that we don't display that full credit card information inappropriately? Yes, because it reduces the risk to my company. It also reduces the risk to our customer. It also makes us compliant for those customers that are doing that level of processing. So I look at it from a risk perspective.
Good question. Obviously, they're very orthogonal, so you want to make sure you're compliant, being a public company like Gail is and McAfee is, and being a public company CEO. What keeps you up at night, you know, for me is, you know, am I out of compliance, and, you know, could I get breached somehow? And I'm not sure which is number 1 or 2 there. They're very close, and it's a challenge in this world today to be compliant with a lot of the changing regulatory bodies that are out there all over the world, as well as be secure with all the threats that are happening. It's a bit of a challenge, but I think they have to go together. As Gail said, you got to understand your risk. Many times having good security will make you compliant, and that's important as well, especially with PCI, but they're both important.
I don't have too much to add, but for the cases that I've looked at, PCI compliance, for example, it seems that good security practices would lead you to compliance. It seems like a good situation there anyway.
If you ask the question, though, about the ability to be able to demonstrate compliance, it might be a different question, you know, because all the regulatory bodies want you to be able to demonstrate and have evidence, and you know, so you have to be able to track the testing, and you have to do all these kinds of things. So, you know, that in itself has gotten to be big business in my world, in being able to do that. So. I don't know. That could be a fair debate.
Hi, Subros on Microsystems. This is more of an enterprise question. It seems like one of the biggest challenges is management awareness. The management wants to know how much money to spend on security and compliance, but at the same time, the vendors haven't made effort in conveying the effectiveness. So in marketing, they say that I have, I don't know which 50% of the money is effective. Similarly, how do you come up with a standard across vendors which allows practitioners to convey the effectiveness of controls as well as the efficiency?
Very, very difficult problem. Yep. I mean, I think the current state of the art, as I understand it, for decision making in the CISO's office is kind of, like this. So I don't know that we have really good models of risk, of what to invest in. And in part, the problem has to do with data about the risks you're facing as much as issues about how effective the defensive mechanisms would be.
At least from one vendor, from McAfee's standpoint, we've tried hard to come up with ways in which customers can compare themselves to one another. And it may not be an industry bar, but you can come up with ways where one industry can compare itself to others in the same industry or across industries. We have some nice risk technologies where we come up with a found stone score. In our case, it was called found stone, but found scores that can really come up and say, what's my risk? How does my risk compare to others in my industry? How do I compare myself? What's my effectiveness versus others? So there is some things that are out there that you can use to help understand where you're at vis-a-vis your others in your peer groups. And many times we see our customers use those types of tools to assess, am I way down or am I above? Where am I at? And how do I relate to others in my types of peer groups? And those are wonderful tools to do as well. So you could show management, okay, how do I justify myself vis-a-vis everyone else in my industry, or even across other industries or other public companies or private companies or smaller companies. Helps a lot.
I think that, IT is always in a cost-cutting mode, and I live in IT, and, that's just the name of the game today. How can you do more, run more, and do it for less? I think the challenge that we have as a security leader of an organization is to be able to, first of all, articulate what your risks are, and those risks need to be real. They can't be, the sky is falling because of, something you read in the paper or whatever. I mean, they have to be real. You have to be able to demonstrate that you have them. And you have to be able to communicate that to your management, that is looking at your overall spend and communicate to them in business terms the risk, because they can understand that. They don't understand firewalls and intrusion detection and those kinds of things. But if you can tell them what that benefit that will bring and the layer of protection it'll put in place and the likelihood that it will reduce risk, I think metrics is important, but we don't get really good metrics in the area of security. At least from my perspective, I haven't really seen that problem solved well. We have some, but what does it tell you about your overall security posture? Is it you're not having incidents because your security architecture is really good, or you're not having incidents because you don't know you're having them and your security architecture is not that good? So there's ways that we have to be able to develop to be able to communicate this message. And if you're effective in this job of being a security leader, you can do that well. And you also know how to just sort of prioritize your own risks and go forward with the spend that's important.
The most useful, simple thing I've heard along that line is to take, 3x3 sort of plot: low, medium, and high likelihood, low, medium, and high cost, and try to move things from one quadrant, one of those 9 places to another, and use that as a way of explaining what your security investment will achieve for your company. And the one general piece of advice I'd heard is to put the good things in the upper right, because that's what financial people understand.
But you have to know your risks before you go into that exercise, so you know how you're going to plot things. So it's really important to understand that.
Well, we've been addressing the cybersecurity challenge, and I must say that I feel a little bit better knowing that there are people of the capability that we have on the stage here today, that there's hope. So thank you very much, and I want to have the audience thank you too. So.
Thank you, Dave. And thanks to all of our speakers, to John and to Gina and Richard. We truly appreciate your perspectives and your willingness to share them with us so freely. And as a small gesture of thanks, sorry about that, we have a fine Churchill Club t-shirt for you. We hope you wear it safely and securely. And once again, I'd like to thank McAfee for the generous sponsorship, and to all of you for coming, and Gail, not Gina. Good night.
Thank you.